Hi there, welcome. My name is Jess, and you are on the channel Trans Girl Therapist. For this segment, what I wanted to talk about is the idea of distorted thinking patterns. So, what do I mean when I say that? Am I just talking about not thinking critically or not thinking logically? Kind of, but not really. When I think of what a distorted thinking pattern is, what I think about is they are these narratives or stories that we tell ourselves or tell about our environment and our social life, which inevitably sort of come to harm us. That is, these thoughts, these ideas, bring up very painful feelings and sometimes can create very difficult behaviors. So if we're looking at this from a cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, cognitive behavioral therapy argues that your cognition, that is your thoughts, leads to you feeling certain ways, and then this leads you to have certain behaviors. The idea in this context then would be to change the way you think. Now, you could call this lots of things. You could say re-education, reprogramming, reindoctrination, all sorts of stuff. What I'm thinking about is trying to sort of bring a level of understanding to not only the stories that we tell ourselves, but how and why we tell ourselves that. Okay? And the goal with this is to make a series. I want to go through one of these different thinking patterns, probably once a week for a while until we get a nice solid list. And the goal here with these is going to be to sort of show you guys and teach you guys how to sort of call yourself out when you start doing this, right? What things can you do to stop yourself from going down these rabbit holes that lead nowhere useful, right? And one particularly stuck out to me a lot, actually. So obviously I have to speak generally because I can't speak about specific clients. That would be a violation of HIPAA. So what I'll say is this. I've noticed in the last several weeks a trend, that is a pattern, in which the narrative that I hear in sessions is something akin to, I am a burden, right? This idea that whoever the person is who's speaking is saying, I am a burden, that my existence is somehow burdensome and unfortunate towards those around me. And often this narrative goes towards an idea that goes past that. It's not just that I'm a burden, it's that I'm actively creating harm. I want you guys to think about that for a moment. Try to notice that. If that's something you notice in yourselves, I would talk to your therapists. I would talk to the people you work with or in your own personal work. The idea that your needs are burdensome. And just like all of the cognitive distortions, all of these distorted thinking patterns, this is no different. This is by its nature a very reductive statement. The reason I say that is that what this is essentially doing is it's basically taking and conflating the needs of a person and the status of a person and sort of using them in a way to justify people's mistreatment of us. So I'll say that a different way. By having the notion that you are a burden, that you are somehow harmful, that your needs are burdensome, that you are not just by existing, you're somehow doing harm. Whatever variation of that flavor is, this idea is really painful. And what it leads to is some really unfortunate outcomes. Most notably, the one that stands out to me is the idea that if my needs or my status, my identity is somehow burdensome to another human being, then I don't bring those things up. In fact, I shut down, right? I don't want to bring these things up, and I feel uncomfortable doing so, which means in future relationships, I might, for example, not feel comfortable bringing those up. And I also might have a hard time sort of figuring out boundaries in regards to this, because it can go both ways. Why don't you take a look at this? Boop. So we're going to zoom in on this a little bit. Found this lovely thing. And the one I want you to look at today is specifically the control fallacies. And I'll read these out to you guys. If you feel externally controlled, you see yourself as helpless and a victim of fate. Not relevant to what we're talking about today, but an interesting point. The fallacy of internal control has you responsible for the pain and happiness of everyone around you. Hey, Hanging Wednesday, welcome. And so this is what I wanted to kind of focus on, is this idea of the internal control, because I've seen people go both ways with this. They tend to either, one, go towards the place where their needs are harmful or burdensome, and then they kind of walk tiptoed through their life, not wanting to damage anything or disturb anyone too much. But this also causes them not to self-advocate. It causes them not to be assertive. It causes them not to assert their needs in relationships or push back on people who are harming them. All sorts of shit, right? But it also can be this internal control, right? That you are suddenly responsible for the pain and happiness of everyone around you. This is by its nature a violation of boundaries, because what it's doing is taking responsibility for the other. By seeing yourself as burdensome, you then, in some ways, what I've seen with people is that they then take on more in some way to compensate. And it's not quite the caregiver dynamic. I'll talk about that on another stream. But one of the caregiver dynamics I'll see sometimes is the sort of give care to get care. If you're an Enneagram nerd, it's literally the thing twos do. But this is true even just beyond people who, learn Enneagram. The reality of the situation is that there's a very real way that folks who deal with the I am a burden narrative will start to take on responsibility for everything. So a good example is this. So let's say client A is someone who suffers from the you are a burden, right? You are a burden narrative. Client B has their own shit, as we all do. And essentially what happens is Hanging Wednesday, that would be rad. I would like to do some Enneagram content. I would like to try to do it from a clinical perspective, though, because sometimes that stuff gets into like weird, like pseudo-spiritual stuff. But I agree in principle. I think that's a good idea. And the invitation, by the way, still exists if you want to help me make the document for conservatism as pathology, because I know we've seen enough studies about libertarians and lack of empathy and all that other shit. I think having an actual like Google Docs on that would be fucking neat. Anywho, so person A has the burden narrative. Person B has their own shit, and one of the things they tend to do is get frustrated easily. So you can already see how this dynamic's going to go. Person B gets irritated about something. Maybe the person's not advocating for themselves. Maybe it's something that has nothing to do with their conversation with person A. And then person A internalizes their anger as though, one, I did something wrong. Two, I am responsible for all of this. Three, that I have done something harmful, right? Except the problem is that when you take on this level of responsibility in the situation, what you're essentially doing is taking away the other person's capability of making choices. Like, yes, person B is getting irritated. That might be something they legitimately struggle with, but they're still responsible for it. Now, granted, if this is something that comes from trauma or something that comes from previous difficulties, difficult upbringing, things like that, then obviously we're empathetic to that. Like, we have to be. But I think we have to sort of settle in this place where we recognize the context of a thing, right? We recognize the context of why a person does what they do, and we also actively and completely attempt to hold them responsible for these things. Because there's a difference between thoughts and feelings and behavior. Now, granted, I'm the first to argue that behaviors can often be understood better through looking at context, looking at the context clues, looking at the systemic effects. And I think it's really important to discuss the idea. How do I want to say this? I think it's really important in relationship to make sure that you're not overly or reductively taking responsibility. I think either way can lead to a bit of a problem. If you don't take responsibility, this can easily lead to being incredibly toxic. If you take too much responsibility, you end up in a really, really difficult situation, because now everybody is 100% guilt-free from that perspective. Because I've seen it with people. They'll literally sort of waffle about the idea that the other person has some responsibility. I've seen this in sessions. I've had to argue with people. Sometimes I can be an aggressive bitch in session. And I have to be really clear with people. Like, I have to be careful with the volume sometimes, because my partner can sometimes hear me like getting upset about something. Usually it's because a transphobic parent said some dumb shit. Yes, Trojan Slayer, by the way, welcome. What you're missing is we're talking about distortions of thought. We're talking about distortions of thought that negatively impact us. And yes, absolutely, that is always their fault. That somehow the other person's actions are always justified because I must have done something. Right? Yeah, right? Like, again, lack of responsibility. It must be my partner's fault. Like, you can see where this goes some really toxic places. And the reason I'm focusing on this narrative of you are a burden is because the idea is that by being a burden, we're sort of telling us of a story that isn't in any meaningful way true. Right? Hanging Wednesday said, and if you take on too much responsibility, you also take the autonomy of others. Yes, so fucking true. Because what you essentially do in that circumstance is, by being as incredibly, how do I say this? By inadvertently being as caregiving as possible, by being incredibly like concerned about every effect you have on every single person in every single way, in this sort of overly balanced, sort of overwhelmed way, what inevitably happens is other people's choices start not to matter. That's a self-replicating system of thought, because what it turns into is, well, they just did that because they're mad. Like, this is the shit you would sometimes hear from like domestic abuse victims, right? Oh, well, he was just mad. Work's been really stressful. Yeah, because if you're somebody that goes with the idea of being burdensome, every need you have is treated as such. And again, I would actually even argue that if we're talking about specifically what's on screen, right? We're talking about these control fallacies. This first one here, if you feel externally controlled, you see yourself as helpless and a victim of fate. I would say that that narrative happens very easily in situations where the person has been browbeaten, and every time they came to a parent and said, I need something, their parent not only said no, but ridiculed them. What this person inevitably does is stop asking for things. They stop asserting themselves. That's what it is. When you ask for something, when you bring up a need, you're asserting something. You're saying, this is a need. I am asserting I need this. And ideally, what a parent's fucking responsibility would be is to fucking, meet the need if possible. Obviously, getting a pony is not a need. but like say food, water, shelter, those things are important, right? It's like why when the whole internet got mad about Bean Dad, like think about it from that perspective. Everyone got super mad at this guy because he was literally not meeting the basic emotional and mental and physical needs of his daughter. Tova said, also have an emotional boulder on yourself or put on the other person. Yeah. Because again, depending where you place the responsibility, we don't ever seem to place the responsibility in a balanced way. We place the responsibility in an incredibly forceful and incredibly imbalanced way. We either put it all on ourselves or all on them. Right? What story was? Oh, the Bean Dad one. Yeah, it was hilarious until it was not. Like, I just felt like so upset for this. Like, what was this? She like 9, 6, I forget. Like, but she was like a little kid and she just wanted food. Like, yeah, it gave the message survive on your own. That's so fucking true. Trojan Slayer, that's super fucking true. Yeah, no, it absolutely um gives the idea that if you can't figure this out, then spoiler, you have to you get to starve. Like what the fuck? Why is that it? Why would anyone do that? Anyway, back to the point. So what I'm saying with these control fallacies and specifically this narrative of you are a burden is that you're not. It is one of the basic tenets of understanding relationships that everybody by definition is burdensome sometimes, and that's not a problem. It becomes a problem when it becomes an effort to take advantage of the person, or it becomes an effort in which it's to evade responsibility for things that you legitimately need to take responsibility for. But this idea that you're burdensome as sort of like a general, essential idea is patently false. We're all burdensome sometimes. I can't argue that we're not. When I'm in a BPD ball crying because I'm getting panicked and my partner needs to hold me, I'm probably pretty burdensome. When my partner's dealing with a migraine and they barely can think and I'm having to take care of them while balancing 3 other things, yeah, maybe they're a little burdensome. But that's what a relationship is. It's handling those burdens because, at least in the case of my relationship with Zena, and I would say this would be true with a lot of my friendships as well, by definition, we try to balance that stuff out almost naturally. Partially because a lot of the people I talk to and a lot of people I live with or interact with have done stints of therapy. They've all worked on this stuff, or some of them are therapists. Some of them are in their own graduate programs, and some of them are just smart fucking people. Like there are people that are willing to sort of own their shit and also push you to own yours. Like that's really important. This is not, and I want to be very clear with this. This video is not saying that you're never a burden, because I don't think I can make that argument. But I can say that this essential notion of burdensomeness is by its nature harmful. I would actually say that it harms the person holding it. In fact, I'll make the argument and say that every single one of these as we go through them, and we're not doing them all tonight, for the people who just got here, welcome. We're going to go through these once a week. We're going to choose one of these. We're going over control fallacies. We're talking about the personal narrative of you are a burden, and how patently false it is from an essential perspective, from an existential perspective. Kind of illogical too, no? Like you said, we're all burdensome to some extent since we take up physical space. Sometimes our lack of existence can also be burdensome. You need someone who isn't there. What's that last part mean? Can you explain that? Because the first part I agree. Like we're all burdensome at various extents. We all take up physical space. What do you mean by our lack of existence? Like if we don't show up in a situation, we're not like assertive or engaging? Because that could be considered a way in which, you know, it's burdensome by us being separated. Loneliness? Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I would say that that narrative of being a burden would actively lead to some senses of loneliness. Right? I've seen this stuff go in some really weird directions, and like, no judgment to anybody I've ever worked with, but like, I'm trying to think of a good example that's not related to anybody. Here's one. So, like, one of the things that like is sort of a hypothetical scenario where this kind of goes to the level I'm talking about is like during the COVID-19 pandemic, being afraid that you would give someone COVID, despite the fact that you have a negative test, You're taking all the precautions. You're doing everything you can. But this terror that you're going to inflict harm on people via this. Now, granted, I really wish there were people that, maybe took that narrative on a little stronger in the case of Republicans. But this terror that you're going to at any moment and unintentionally, mind you, inflict harm. Like, this is the part that narrative really misses, is the idea that you're not intentionally doing harm. And I realize that harm can still happen unintentionally. But I think there's a very big difference between unintentional harm and intentional harm. Most notably, you can look at this in our criminal justice system. Now, I am not a lawyer, but my understanding is that there's a very big difference between the charge of murder versus manslaughter. And one of the major differences is intention and cruelty, right? So if murder is, I think, what's like some of the versions of it are like premeditated, you do this like with willful cruelty, this is something like you very clearly are doing because you want to, versus someone accidentally hitting someone with a car. Those are hugely different. And while yes, in both circumstances they can lead to death, but yeah, it gets into a problem, right? Trojan Slayer said, like politics, harm can happen at both extremes. Either you're too caring or you aren't at all. Yeah, it just depends on how you want to frame that, Trojan Slayer. Like, I would say that in some ways, one of the issues with that line of thinking is that, like, what do we mean by too caring? Because it depends on what you care about. Again, this is why I don't like essential statements. I really want to make sure we're doing context. Like, a good example of a context thing is, are you talking about human rights? Because I absolutely think you should care about those. But if you're talking about, like, quote, caring, are you talking about like performative caring, like the virtue signal kind of thing? Or like, what do you mean? Like, I'm down for that idea, mind you. I want to understand where you're coming from. Kicking my trash can like a champion. Your own idea of what is good for people. Yeah. So this actually gets into a thing I've talked about before where, not on stream, but it's a thing I've said in previous situations, is like, one of the reasons why I'm very sort of distrustful of the really hardcore activists on any side of things, regardless, is that often what I get the sense of is that they reject the world as it is. They fundamentally reject the world as it is, and they want the world to be the exact picture of perfection they see in their head. And what they don't realize is there's a massive projection onto the world as that is. And what happens is that the world they're constructing is one that is so based on their own sort of egocentric, ethnocentric, sociocentric values and views, that it doesn't really look at reality in any meaningful way, nor does it necessarily create the steps to get there in a lot of cases. Now, I'm probably going to get shit for that statement, but again, this is one of the reasons why I'm very careful with my activist friends, because I want them to really take care of themselves. Sometimes they get so fixated on the idea of the world they want that they end up burning out, because the problem is that there's not a way for you to lead from the way the world is. I would argue from a mindfulness perspective, by definition, you have to start from the premise of the way the world is. You said, Trojan Slayer said, that they refuse to listen to others, hence it stops actively helping. I would say yes, with the asterisk of depending on the circumstance. I would argue if you're talking to Nazis, no, it's fine to just ignore them. Like, if someone's actively trying to bring up the Jewish question, they actively can fuck off. I think it's okay to have boundaries in that regard. I think if the person's bringing up legitimate points or points that feel like they're in good faith, I think that's really solid. Like Trojan Slayer, I would actually point you to, I don't know if you watch some of the debate stuff, but like there was a Twitch debate on Dylan Burns's show where he had on, what was it, Vosh, Demon Mama, some guy named, I think it was Rob, who's a very far right conservative, and then I think there was another guy in there who's kind of a weird hodgepodge of moderate named John. And it was actually really interesting to watch because you could see the thing you're exactly talking about. In that argument, in that debate, Dylan is in fact Pog. I agree. He's also sexy. Just full stop. He's just a cutie. But There you go, Rob Noor and John Burke. So like, it's really weird to see the difference between those two people, because John left that debate going, hey, you know what? I don't necessarily agree with all this, but I learned a lot and I'm going to think about this stuff. Like, that's the best I can fucking ask for. That's way better. It's not like he's fucking doing dog whistles and trying to, like, you know, secretly point at 1350 or some other racist bullshit. No, he was genuinely engaging. Was he sometimes a dick? Was he a little patriarchal? Sure, but fuck, that's a breath of fresh air from conservatives. And he actually was like really hardcore towards the social libertarian perspective, which again, as much as I dislike libertarians, not bad. But like, again, watch him, Trojan Slayer, this guy who's like a moderate, maybe still leaning a little conservative, and Rob, who's like just going off on conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory, right? So we've gone down a rabbit hole. Yes, the difference in the treated Vosh and Demon Mama, though. Yeah, well, and I would argue that there was a point where all of the guys started talking over Demon Mama. I actually think there was an active form of sexism going on in that debate. I don't know if it was intentional. I don't think it was intentional. I think the issue is that what happened is essentially what happened was like it just sort of was argued in such a way, especially in that second round where it eventually turned to that. But this is all off topic. The point I'm trying to laboriously get to is the idea that your mileage may vary, but I think there's a very real argument to be made here that we need to examine these ways we think, because the ways we think lead to ways we feel. And I would argue they lead to us acting in certain behaviors. And the one that really gets under my skin is the idea of not advocating for yourself. And by the way, I'm not saying be angry. This actually has come up with a couple different people as far as clients. This idea that when I've said to them, hey, what do you hear when I say be more assertive? And I've seen it go off into fucking off the rails. Like, I've had one person who thought I was talking about the angry, abusive behavior of a parent. I thought that one person thought I was like saying like they just needed to grow a backbone. And that's not what I mean at all. It means through arguments, through feeling comfortable, through getting more comfortable, you eventually get to the place where you're like, no, I'm allowed to self-advocate. I'm allowed to be happy. I'm allowed to engage in my life in ways as long as it doesn't harm other people. Oh no. What's oh no, Trojan Slayer? There's always a delay, so I'm waiting on you. But yeah, I mean, this idea that you are a burden is patently false. Overbearing parents, for real. Well, and again, this can go a couple ways. The idea that you are a burden often comes from neglectful parents. And I know I give parents so much shit on this show, but like, come on now. Like, I was a shitty parent. I know. Granted, I was in my 20s. I was a closeted trans woman and was in a marriage with someone 6 years older than me who was not mentally well themselves and then subsequently died in a horse riding accident. So, you know, it was a difficult time for everybody. Holy shit. Yeah, no, overbearing parents, I don't know if they lead to this idea of you are a burden. In fact, overbearing parents, I think, actually leads to this idea of like sometimes more towards the external thing of control, but I'd have to think about that. But the idea of the neglectful parents, the parents that are like sort of distant. And again, if you haven't seen it, watch the video about talking about parental styles we did last week. I think that's a really good lead in on that discussion. Right? So again, I think there's some stuff here to talk about and look at. And I just want to make it really clear for everyone that we're going to tackle each of these maybe once a week. Let's see. So when I was kind of younger, I was kind of an assholey. Sure, I guess. What would you say to a younger me to get me to think more about others? I'm still young. That's fair. I'm going to be 40 soon. So, God damn it. Get to be a girl for all of 2 fucking years. God damn it. I better not die early because I swear to God I'll be sad. Jesus Christ. Just finally comfortable in my own body. Thank you. I appreciate that. Chat. You guys are great. So what would I say to a younger you? Churches are, you are so sweet. Anyway, let's see. I find neglectful parents leading to that figure of being burdensome tends to be a thing. I agree. The child can't think of the reason for the parents to be neglectful that isn't something about them. Right? And also what it gets into with that Hanging Wednesday is the idea that, like, what I see is the behaviors when you get into the nitty gritty, what's happening is the parents are actively doing this weird ass thing where, like, the kid comes to them with a need, right? And what ends up happening is that need is not only denied, but it's also ridiculed or aggressively pushed back on in some way, shape, or form, right? And I see this more with authoritarian parents who are both often abusive and neglectful. Thus why you can see people with this burdensome narrative also have a tendency to be afraid of being assertive because they think what's being asked. God damn it, I keep burping. What they think what you're asking is, so you want me to yell at them and throw punches? No, that's not what's being asked of you. Don't do that. Please don't, for many reasons. Or treat it as though need is optional or yes, exactly. Exactly. The need is treated as though it's optional or inconsequential. Such a big fucking deal. Right? By the way, if you're enjoying the stream, please like. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. And if you want to donate, you can go to streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. Let's see. Ryan said, my parents have kind of done that, not necessarily so aggressively, but will frame things as my fault. Yeah, and that's so the problem is when I say authoritarian, what often people hear is like violent parents, like emotionally or physically violent. What I would say is actually much more common is emotion. Yeah, it does sound like fucking being dad, for real. True. But the way in which they will always turn the narrative back on you, not only does that lead to the narrative that you are inherently a burden, right? Which is false. But what it also does is takes the fucking like searchlight off them for them being responsible parents. And in some ways, that's actually a more effective way of being authoritarian or abusive, because what it does is it actually emotionally is so hurtful that it makes you question all of your needs. So like, let's say you're someone who's like considered yourself somewhere in the variation of trans, like you get into a problem where if they push back on that, you can suddenly get really confused and very doubtful, and it's really shitty. It really, really sucks. Right? So like, I think it's really important to be aware of this narrative and how to push back against it. And one of the ways I would say to push back against that is that one, I would find a therapist. Again, I am not your therapist, but also I would argue that I would start really getting critical about the way people interact with you. What is their intention? Obviously, we can't know in full because there's always, such a thing as projection, but we want to just look at it. So when, like, for example, with Ryan, what I would say is like, so your parents aren't aggressive, but they always will frame things as your fault, regardless of the reality, I assume. I assume they just kind of do that with everything. And if they do, then what I would argue is that in some ways, this is very convenient to them as a way to not really have to be in any way introspective. They don't have to look at their parenting. They don't have to think about what things did they do that led to this context. At the same time, I do think that parents need to be a tad bit aggressive with their children. Poor choice of words, I know. Since my parents were like the ideal parents, but I ended up it cut off. Damn it. Why did it cut off? I don't know if they need to be aggressive. I would disagree with that. I would say they need to be assertive. I think they need to be good at creating structure. And I would argue that additionally, where structure really, really changes is cut oof because there's a time limit to that. Yeah. Yeah, and I can see where that would be so, because at that point, I don't know if that would actually be related to your. By the way, everyone, trigger warning for suicide. Please make sure to put trigger warnings in chat. Appreciate it. But yeah, I would say I don't know if that's unrelated to your parents. I would wonder if that's in some ways related more to other factors or genetic factors or environmental factors or some other source. Or it could be, and this does happen. Hanging Wednesday knows this. You're fine, Trojan. That's fine. Just be aware for next time. But like, think about it like this. If your parents are ideal, which I don't necessarily believe, no one's ideal, but let's say they're really good, they're really on it. It doesn't mean that a kid, for whatever reasons, still not going to miss a message, right? That's literally one of the things that's central about the Enneagram personality stuff that Hanging Wednesday and I was bringing up earlier. Like, the idea is that literally it's a missing message. Zena, did you need something?
Oh, I was just gonna type in. I think we've derailed a little bit so far.
Okay. Fair enough. So why don't we? It took me a time. Yes, therapist.
Yeah.
If I could end on this with any point, it's go to a therapist.
That is definitely a therapist thing. As far as like child rearing, like there are ways to help teach children emotional maturity, and like non-violent conflict resolution and kind of ways to talk things out. There are ways to teach those skills to kids.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they're always well known to all the parents out there, but there are ways to do that.
Well, and I absolutely agree, 100%. And I think there are such things as parenting classes, books, ways to kind of work on that skill. Hanging Wednesday mentioned in chat to Trojan, there's a difference between being assertive and aggressive. Parents really shouldn't ever be aggressive, in my view. I agree, because by definition, I think assertiveness is making clear boundaries, clearly stating where you're coming from, and holding to those boundaries. On the other hand, I also think that aggressiveness actually comes from a different place. Again, please go back and watch the video about parenting styles, because you'll see this in authoritarian parenting. They're being aggressive because their goal is maliciousness. Their goal is to inflict harm to teach a lesson, but there's no real gain or lesson. There's no real change of behavior. It's just some type of harm. No worries about the poor choice words. But anyway, we've gone off rails. I want to be really clear about this. You are not a burden. Full stop. And you are not responsible for everyone's trauma. You're not responsible for everyone's needs. You're not responsible for every single thing. Now, if you choose to bring a little rugrat in the world, that's a different discussion. But if we're talking about just the average person in the world, like, yeah, be empathetic, be caring. But I think the fact is that we have to challenge these notions. And that's what this series is going to be about. So if you enjoyed watching this video, please consider liking and subscribing. If you want to donate to the channel to help me and Zena, really would freaking help. You can go to streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. I would also say that if you really are, oh, bye Trojan, see ya. If you really enjoy this work, and yes, please hit the bell for notifications, the damn notifications. And last but not least, if you really want to support our work, one of us is working, the other one isn't because of health issues. Anything you can donate helps. But if you want to join and become a Patreon subscriber, you can. That's at patreon.com/transgirltherapist. So with that said, I hope this was helpful. I know we kind of got off the rails, but I think it was still a really good conversation with chat. And I just want to say, I hope I see you in the next one. Okay? See you soon. To grab my book.
Yeah, I might have more thoughts on the I am a burden thing from like a PMDD perspective. I think that'd be a really interesting way to explore that.
We could always do a video about that at some point. I think that'd be really cool, especially if you're dealing with something as difficult as that. I would say like anything like in the ballpark of like personality disorder, PMDD. Like,
yeah,
it's really, actually I just had this conversation with someone on Twitter. Essentially what happened was, there we go. Essentially what happened was I was talking to someone who also struggles with BPD, and what they did was, I'll scoot over so you don't have to be behind chat. What they did was mention that, hey, I see you guys out there being abusive to people with BPD, and I fucking see you. Like, they were really being kind of on about it. And the reason why I wanted to mention this is because there is this thing that comes with someone who has borderline, like myself, where it's very easy to operate under the notion of I am a burden to everyone around me. Aw, Ryan said hello, bun. Yeah, that's a bun. She's brought herself into the camera. I turned off the blur. I usually do that just to hide our dirty ass room. But like, yeah, when Zena's in frame, I'm just gonna do that because the blur only works with one person. It's fine. But yeah, I think there would be a really good discussion about PMDD and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on that if you want to just add them in?
I see a lot of people really struggle with how to handle this in relationships, particularly because PMDD is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. And one of the big things that happens is that the person with PMDD has very extreme moods, and these last for a very long time, and this happens about the week before like the period begins. And it's not something you can control really, and it's medication can be a mess for some people. And so when somebody's having some really extreme reactions to something, or the emotions are very extreme, right? Even if the reaction isn't, it can get really messy to kind of work with your partner to kind of figure out how to deal with these situations. And so I see a lot of people have a really hard time because their partner will also get like wrapped up in this whole thing and will end up fighting with them, or kind of absorb some of like the thoughts or the anger that is coming up. And so it can be easy for both people to feel like they're a burden on either end of things. So I think that's some of what I see.
Thank you, Hanging Wednesday. I appreciate the $5. And yes, I will move out of the way because I think that Bun was stealing Zena's thunder in that discussion because the whole time her face kept moving closer to the behind us. This is the Bun Bun. She's on the cover of the thing. She's a Bun Bun.
She is very cute.
She's very cute. She's a cute.
Oh, look at that tail.
Aw. She's such a baby. We love her so much.
She is great.
She's such a good girl.
She is very nice to have around, especially when your brain is exploding with thoughts. And she is like, no, I'm just going to snuggle you now. This will be great. I'm going to come check on you.
Oh, it's really great if like one of us is having like a mood issue or we're just really emotional. Like she will just come and lay with us and be like, I have decided to snuggle you because it is time. She is a good doggo. Full stop. She is a good doggo. All right. Yeah. And I guess like, yeah, my thought is like the only analogous thing I can do, because obviously I don't have PMDD, is like you and I went through this at the beginning of our relationship because there was this really hard tension of like, I'm having these really hard reactions coming up that I don't know what to do with or how to control. And then on top of it, I get to then feel like shit about it because I feel like I'm burdening or hurting you. So it's I either try to figure out these feelings and like speak to them, or I'm like, but if I do that, I feel like I might do harm because they don't always come out great. And or I hold them back and I hurt myself that way. And either way, what ends up happening is I still feel like I'm hurting you in some way, shape, or form. Like that stuff's really sucky.
Yeah. I think at some point we got good at kind of checking in with about where we're at and what we can handle. Also,
no, that's super true.
Therapist. My therapist at the time was super great and was like, no, this stuff isn't about you. You can't take this stuff into you. And we really worked on that. Like I needed that. And that was amazing. And I was really happy because that was probably like the first therapist that was really like able to actually work on stuff with me. And like get at some of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Like my past therapist would have just missed this stuff entirely. But no, therapy super helped.
No, absolutely.